they were like, oh, her music isn't really about fighting. It's like body yada yada. You know what I'm saying? Like stuff like that.
And I saw someone on Instagram post, if this is our resistance, then I'm gonna be sent to a forced labor camp. And I thought that was like a little bit too on the nose.
I kind of like that Amy Coney Barrett isn't falling in line with Trump. I think that he expected her to be a Trump loyalist, and the fact that she isn't is definitely throwing him off. Me too. Yay for optimism. We like never end that on like a Trump segment, I feel like. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another week of Watched Up Weekly. I'm Abby, and this is Colin, and it is week 9.
We're almost on double digits now, which is insane. And we have a couple of things maybe for episode 10 we're gonna toss in, so stay tuned for that next week. But I think this week we're gonna do the same thing we did last week and start off on a positive note. I think that starting off that way helps us to kind of prepare for the rest of the show and also frame things in a light where it's more optimistic. Did you have an easier time finding a positive story this week?
No.
Man, it's still tough, to be honest.
We're all about honesty here, and no, I did not. I did look through the link you had sent me, Colin, about or from last week. Colin had sent me a newsletter, right? Was it a newsletter
Yeah.
link? And I didn't really find anything that I liked on there. And so I just resorted to being like, good news from this past week. But again, like last episode, we were talking about how we get kind of skeptical when it comes to good news. So I had
Good
to.
news is just bad news in disguise.
No, seriously, it's like bad news, but with a good PR team.
Literally.
Um,
All right, so
I
what
did
was
get a new mic, guys. This is my new mic. So if my audio is different, that's why. Please let us know if it's worse or better. Anyways, okay, we can move on now.
yeah, so what was your story? You said it was more of a feature good news story?
Yeah, I feel like it's hard for me to find hard news, I guess, that's good. Um, so my good news story is about how um these doctors had restored sight to people who were blinded in eye accidents using a new stem cell treatment. And I don't think it works for people who are like born blind or anything like that, but it's for people who have suffered eye injuries and had their sight before that, but now their sight is being
Mm.
restored, successfully repairing like previously irreversible damage. And yeah, like it was an experimental procedure, and they had safely restored 14 corneal surfaces and had followed up with them after 18 months, and they're still pretty good. So yeah, it's called the team said that it's a 90% effective at restoring sight. And the reason why I chose this story was because I kind of have an irrational fear that one day I'll wake up and like get seriously injured or something when it comes specifically to my eyes, or a fear that I'm going to become blind. And let me tell you why. My eyesight is really, really bad. And this doesn't have anything to do with like an accident, like how these people suffered accidents. Like, I'm not trying to compare myself to them, but I just have this very, very rational fear that one day I'm going to be blind because every year my eyesight gets different. And for the people who have bad eyes, like I'm now at a negative 6.5 in both eyes. So, like, almost legally blind. And whenever I can, I'm going to get LASIK. And to think if my eyes get messed up in LASIK, that it could be reversed, that makes me feel better.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a good story. And I know stem cell research has kind of been a developing thing. I was just listening to Joe Rogan had some guest on. He was talking about how they use stem cells to repair like a torn shoulder or something like this. And
Hmm.
I don't really fully understand the technology, but it sounds like it can do a lot of like tissue repair. So stuff that would have required like more invasive surgery or more, I don't know, aggressive treatment can now just, I don't know. Do you know how it works? Like, do they just inject you with stem cells and then the stem cells change into whatever cell needs repair or replacement?
For this one, I think they had taken different stem cells or something like that and like grown it into their corneal surface, is basically my understanding of it. But like I probably said it wrong
No,
slightly.
that's really interesting.
But it seems very innovative. So I'm always a fan of like medicine advancing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of promise in that field, particularly right now. So that's a really great story. Um,
Yeah, I think it's really cool too. Yeah. I know that they work on stem cells in cancer. Like, or my roommate, my ex-college roommate, she did an internship in Sweden where they worked on stem cell research in regard to solving breast cancer, and she was like a small part of the research in coding for that. So I think that's like really cool and great what we can do with technology because a lot of the time technology scares me nowadays. Sometimes with AI, so it's good to hear good news about technology and what it can do for us.
That's actually a topic that I have an aunt who is kind of on the forefront of that because she had leukemia when she was 29 and it was a pretty bad case. And they were trying out all these different experimental procedures and trials. And they were able to, I think, well, they definitely use stem cells, but I think it was actually the stem cells that was like from a umbilical cord because there's a lot of stem cells passing in between like mother and baby, and doesn't stem cells derive from like, I don't know, like, is it fetal tissue or like how does that, I don't know how they derive it or produce it, but one of the less controversial ways that they can acquire stem cells is actually in like the leftover umbilical cord essentially. And this was like 20 years ago or something, so
Yeah,
it's advanced
so
a lot, I think.
okay.
But
What is your
I
new good news story, Colin?
Well, okay, so like I said, double-edged sword, good, good and bad. I was just gonna say that the jobs report came out for February, the like first full month of Trump being in office, and the U.S. economy did add 151,000 new jobs, like seasonally adjusted, is what it said, um, which I take as a positive. I mean, there's a lot of people kind of, I don't know, pooping on it, saying like, well, it was supposed to be 160,000. And I get that argument. Like, it might not be the strongest showing in terms of numbers that there's ever been. And certainly there are some economic indicators, which we'll get into later, about maybe the economy not doing so well. But I think a win is a win, and more jobs is more jobs. And it's actually, I think, good news in light of like Doge and all of the cuts that have been made to the job market, because it's sort of, despite all of that, there's still some progress being made in terms of strengthening the economy. And yeah, I don't know. So that's my good news this week. But again, you kind of have to take it with a grain of salt this time.
No, I think that's good news. I definitely think that's good news. And in our topics today, we'll get a little bit into the economy, specifically more when we talk about tariffs. So I think that ties in good.
Um, I think we could just go into our first topic for the week because we have a lot to get into with Trump's joint address with Congress. Everyone that I've been listening to is making like this qualifier of like, it wasn't a State of the Union because he's too new in office, but for all intents and purposes, it felt like a State of the Union. So,
Yeah, yeah.
did you watch the whole thing or just kind of
No,
pick out clips?
I
Yeah.
did not watch the whole thing. I didn't have time. I know like off camera we've talked about it, but I had like a really, really busy work week and I was just like dealing with a lot there. So I've only kind of picked out clips here and there, read stories, listened to podcasts about it, stuff like that. What about you? Did you watch the whole thing?
No, it's kind of like when they had Zelensky in like 2 weeks ago. I just did not have time, same as you, like to watch the whole thing. So I really just heard p other people's comments on it. But I feel like I got a feel for it. Like, what was your takeaway from this?
Yeah, I also got a feel from it. My takeaway was that he's gonna keep on making these changes and stuff like that. I listened to a really good podcast episode about from Ezra Klein. I think you had listened to it as well because I texted you about it, right?
Yep.
And he kind of got into the nitty-gritties of like analyzing Trump's like rhetoric. And I think it was in regard to this. Yeah, it definitely was, I think. And I agreed with a lot of what he was saying about Trump's strategy. And like, I mean, I feel like we've been on this ongoing um, analysis about Trump and his theatrics and all this stuff. I thought part, a really interesting part of it was when he was like talking about Doge's changes and all this stuff. And I don't know, when it comes to Doge and, all that stuff, I think that a lot of the time I'm against it, which I think is very clear to the viewers. What did you think about it?
Well, I liked what Ezra Klein said about, particularly he was talking about how Trump kind of slips in these like little mistruths, and he always talks about how he had like this big election win and like a mandate from the people, which as we'll get into, some people objected to. But Ezra Klein was saying that he thinks that Trump including these little mistruths is sort of a loyalty test, and how
Yeah,
he wants to see how everyone around him is going to react. Like, are they going to call him on his BS, or is he just going to get away with? It's a very slippery slope when you start telling like little mistruths or like bending the truth or even using like very excessive hyperbole. It can kind of take on this tone of falsity, even if it's factually, true. And a lot of what Trump says is not even factually true. I think it's interesting in regards to people like JD Vance, who I had been kind of hopeful would be sort of a bit more like firm in his own right and like push back when he disagreed with Trump. And it kind of seems like everyone in the administration has kind of fallen in line. And that was my main takeaway from this congressional speech as well, was that Congress had also kind of, fallen behind Trump and gotten in line. And, as we've been talking about, I'd like to see a little bit more pushback.
yeah. The more and more that I hear Trump speaking, or the more and more that I hear the right side and their, yes, mistruths and stuff like that, I think to myself about how the only change that is going to happen is from the inside out. I was talking to a friend over the weekend, and she was telling me, like, Abby, like, what do you think the future is? Like, what do you think everything's going to be like in 2028? And I was like, oh God. Like, I was like, I have no idea. But it really got me thinking. I thought that was a really good question, especially hearing from somebody our age who she's like works in business, finances, is doing taxes and stuff. So it's like not something up her wheelhouse usually. And I was like, oh, I really like that you just sparked this. And I was thinking to myself, like, yeah, like what is the future? Like the only way I think that people are able to communicate is if you meet them halfway. Like you're not going to convince any super, super right-leaning person that everything is wrong by like going through extreme measures. Like if you are convincing somebody of something, the change needs to happen incrementally and you need to meet them at the most moderate point. And I think that that's what the future of the Party needs to be, but especially the Republican Party needs to have people stand up against him and kind of do that from the middle out thing.
Yeah, so what you just said sparked a couple things. First, I think we've also talked about how the Democrats have kind of lost their footing. They don't really have a platform at the moment. There's no like heir apparent to, run in 2028, and that's a little bit disconcerting. We saw them at this test or this speech before Congress. They had like these little paddles that had little slogans on them, and I saw someone on Instagram post, if this is our resistance, then I'm going to be sent to a forced labor camp. And I thought that was like a little bit too on the nose, um, but amusing. But to the point about pushback coming from the Republican or the right side against Trump, did you see Amy Coney Barrett, and what did you think about that?
Yes, her little eye roll. Oh my gosh. It was trending a lot on the left side, for positive reasons. And then I saw right side of people being like, what is going on with her? Like, why isn't she on Trump's side? I kind of like that Amy Coney Barrett isn't falling in line with Trump. I think that he expected her to be a Trump loyalist, and the fact that she isn't is definitely throwing him off, which I think is a good thing. Like, I don't think anyone should be a loyalist to like any sort of politician. I think every single politician deserves to be checked and balanced. I don't believe in like loyalism to that. Like, I don't believe in um idolizing politicians, idolizing anyone, but especially politicians. And Amy Coney Barrett's like little eye roll gave me a little bit of hope. And I was talking to a friend about it as well, and she was saying how she was surprised about Coney Barrett's reaction. And I said, well, I think it's surprising, but not really, because she is a very strong constitutionalist. Like, she's very conservative, obviously, but her foundation comes from the Constitution, and she's so fundamentally strong in that I think that any sort of anti-constitutional actions that Trump may be taking or anything that might be going on that side, that's something that she is willing to speak out against.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and it's hard to gauge exactly where her mind is at with like just a simple eye roll, but it did evoke a lot, and there was a huge response to it. Like you said, from the left and the right. The right was trying to say, well, they kind of dogpiled on her and were saying like, oh, she's like a DEI pick, which
Yeah, slap in the face.
is so insulting for so many reasons. And a bit ironic because she was appointed by Trump in 2020. Um, I've always kind of been a bit of a ACB fan. I remember when she was appointed by Trump in 2020, I liked the way that she conducted herself a lot in her hearings with the Senate. This was during COVID, before the 2020 election. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had just died, and the Democrats in the Senate were trying to say like, oh, it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying wish that like we shouldn't appoint a conservative to replace her. I thought that that was BS, and that if the shoe was on the other foot, then the Democrats would have been trying to appoint someone just like they had done with Merrick Garland during Obama's term. So I thought like the political strategy and the way that they got Amy Coney Barrett through was a kind of hopeful at the time for me, who was more Republican at that point in time, before January 6th, before the 2020 election. So I've always kind of had like a secret affinity for her, and the way that she, in her hearing, like held up, they asked her like, are you like reading this off of something? Like you know your stuff so well. And she's like held up this blank little notepad, and it was kind of an iconic moment. I think she's extremely smart. She has, all of the experience, and I was a fan of her initially. I still am a fan of her because I tend to think the Congress should be the ones like making the laws and maybe pushing the limits, being a little bit more progressive. I like the Supreme Court to be a little bit more conservative and, like you've been saying, like true to the Constitution. I think that that's their role. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah, that's a really good point that you all just made. I took constitutional law, and I did find that the judges who stuck more to the rule of law and to the Constitution, I had more respect for, even if I don't agree with their political alignment or values per se. And that's kind of how I feel about ACB. Like, there's definitely a lot that I disagree with her on, and um, like for example, like her religious affinities. Like, I'm not very like that in terms of the Catholic Church, and like all of that. Yeah, I have respect for her for not just following in line with one of like Trump's like loyal maggots. Like, I think that it's a good thing to have somebody again make that change from the inside out, even though it was just a little eye roll. I know we're like
yeah.
jumping the gun, but the whole social media is. So I think
No,
that that's what
the
bandwidth
public is
about.
starving for that though. Like they want the pushback coming from people on the right to Trump. And if it's something as simple as an eye roll can evoke like so much, kind of response, then it shows what I think people are really wanting right now from their public officials.
Yeah,
Mm.
it kind of reminded me of like, like how small actions make big changes. This is such a example of that to me. Even though it's just this little eye roll, it really sparked a huge conversation online from both ends.
And it's interesting, like I think that to what you're saying, the constitutionalists in the Supreme Court could end up being kind of the people who are the most effective at the resistance to overreach from the executive. I mean, that's not only is it their role prescribed by the Constitution, but I think the justices who stick more to the Constitution, I think, are more effective in the long run because they're less likely to make rulings that will later be overturned. Like that was
Yes.
kind of one of the issues with Roe was that as a precedent that it set, it was on shakier ground, like in terms of its adherence to the Constitution. I think a lot of Roe was decided on the basis of like privacy, and that was kind of easy for the other side to poke holes in and then eventually overturn. But if the justices are consistently ruling in a more constitutionalist way, then it's really hard to make arguments that will then later be overturned with like dramatic and big consequence.
I'm really interested to see more of ACB's actions, especially after this. I think that it gave some people this glimmer of hope that is much needed.
Yeah, and the reason also why she's kind of in the spotlight is because she sided with the more liberal justices against Trump in terms of US aid money. She said that it should be dispersed to the like contractors who had already done work on behalf of the government. And Doge and all of the executive branch is trying to put a freeze on that spending. And I guess her joining up with the liberals in on the court um, said that the money needs to be dispersed. So
Yeah, that's a good call out to make too. Like even with this eye roll, there is some action that is saying she's not only gonna align with all of what Trump and Doge wants.
so we saw pushback from the right. How about Al Green and his pushback from the left? Did you see that?
Yes, I did. Yeah. What did you think first?
Well, I mean, he basically just stood up in the middle of the speech, and I think he had a cane, is what I heard. And he was yelling something about when Trump said he had a mandate. I don't know what he yelled, but he was saying something in response to that. And this is kind of precedented. Like during Obama's speech in 2009, there was a representative who yelled, "You lie," really loud, and that kind of made a big fuss. But Al Green was actually removed from Trump's speech and then later censured. So I don't understand the nuances of
I
censuring.
was actually going
uh,
to ask you how much you understand about censoring because
Very
I
little.
looked it up. Okay, cool. Because I looked it up and I was like, okay, what is censure? I kept, when I was listening to, because I listened to a podcast while I work, and I kept thinking that they were saying censored at first. And I was like, wait, what? Like, what are they censoring him from? Like, I don't know. I was like, I'm against this. But then I was like, wait, they're saying something so different. What does that mean? And from my understanding, it just means that they get like put in timeout. Like, I just don't really know what else
Basically,
it
yeah.
means.
I
Um,
agree. I really have no clue either, so maybe we can circle back to that if it becomes relevant. But it does definitely seems a bit like a slap on the wrist. It's a bit performative, but it's kind of performative in the same way that I think a lot of the whole speech was very performative, and like for both the right and the left, it gave them this like outlet to express their grievances or their like wins in Trump's case, and just the whole thing. We've been talking a lot about theatrics and just the ways that they're essentially on like this 4-year long PR campaign, and this just felt like the latest moment for that pretty much.
I think that I have always been a fan of symbolic, peaceful protesting. I think it's powerful in its simplicity most of the time. And yeah, I've always been a fan of that, but I think that this was, again, like you said, theatrical and performative, and like sometimes I just imagine it and I'm like, oh, you guys are like literal grown adults. Like, I don't know. It's just I always say it's satirical, and it's because it is. Like,
Well, the other thing that I think is very performative is when they bring in these like guests, and I'm not even gonna get into the specifics of the guests that like Trump brought in because I frankly don't really, I'm not that interested. But I think that a lot of times the people who like the president selects to sit in on the speech so that he can like make reference to them up in the balcony or something, I just see it all as like more political theater, more charade, more like trying to win a PR war. And it was as we've been, I feel like very consistent on this show. Like neither you nor I are really that interested in like engaging that or like even really talking about it. It's just this sort of I don't know. And I feel like maybe this is something that our generation can agree with. Like we don't really want to participate if we feel like people are being used as like pawns or part of a larger PR scheme.
I think that Gen Z has a very big affinity for authenticity, more so than others, I want to say. I think that I agree with you when it comes to, obviously, I agree with you. I feel like we're always trashing PR a little bit, but I want to hope that our generation has a little bit more skepticism in them and the power, I guess, to enact on that authenticity. I think that's the reason why we don't like famous people as much, why people are speaking out against like say influencers and stuff like that. And like don't get me wrong, I love my influencer here or there, but I'm against again like idolizing people. And I think that a lot of people in our generation are.
Anything else from his speech in general that you took away from it? Oh, did you see the one representative who like died right after the speech?
Oh yeah, I looked it up after you had initially texted me about that because we were discussing how that would have been a horrible last activity to go with.
Yeah. His name was Rep. Sylvester Turner. He was from Houston. I think he was the mayor of Houston for a while. Um, and he had been like tweeting before attending this speech about how they like shouldn't end or touch Medicaid. And I don't know. It's just like you said, like I can't imagine that that's the last thing you ever do on earth is like go to a speech by Donald Trump that you don't want to be at and are completely opposition to. Like that would just be rough.
Not a good way to go out. Do you know he died of natural causes, right?
It wasn't really, I mean, yeah, I think it was natural,
It's
but
old, he's older.
yeah, he had been like fighting cancer for a while, and I don't know if that was what ultimately he died from, but regardless, it's, you know, kind of sad.
Yeah. That sucks that that's the last activity he had to go to, but um yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. But do you have anything else you want to talk about for
Um,
this
just the
section before
last
we move
thing that came to mind, witnessing like Al Green get up and then get censured. I know it probably seems like these are very like not civil times or there's been like a breakdown in the communication between right and left. But it called to mind there was an incident in 1856 where the Senator Charles Sumner was attacked by Representative Preston Brooks with a cane. Like, I think he was in the middle of some congressional proceeding and he literally just beat him with a cane and almost killed him. And I just wanted to like throw that in because as bad and as it seems when things get really uncivil and the sides are kind of going at each other, I think we're at least pretty far from that historical happening, and I hope that we as we start to see a little bit more pushback coming from the left and the right against Trump, I think it'll ramp up, and I think there are ways to do it peacefully, and I'm actually pretty optimistic that people are thinking a lot about these things.
Me too. Yay for optimism. We like never end that on like a Trump segment, I feel like. But we are still talking about Trump, everyone. Are you ready to move on to the next
Yeah,
topic?
yeah. So how about these
Okay.
tariffs?
Okay. Yeah, I feel like we've been touching on tariffs a little bit for the past couple weeks, but Trump's tariffs were just recently enacted. How I understand what this strategy is that he wants to do is that he's enacting these tariffs because he eventually wants the American manufacturing to be cheaper and better for like consumers and also workers. But what he's doing right now is making everything cost more for everyone. Um, I saw this article where the New York Times called it his quote biggest economic battle, and I agree with this label, like it or not battle, gamble. I totally agree with this label. I think that it is such a gamble to be doing all of this. Like he wants to raise revenue, he wants to balance trade and bring rival countries to heel to the US. And I just don't know that he can do all three.
Right. I mean, it seems like he's doing this as a way of sort of leveraging, or he sees it as another like card he can play, kind of like what we've been seeing what he's doing in foreign policy with Ukraine and Gaza, where he'll like start off on he'll make like a really, really terrible deal or like do something really provocative, and then he'll like maybe walk it back. And so the second offer that he has seems like a better deal, and they'll be more likely to accept it. I feel like that's what he's doing with tariffs too. He's starting off with like 25% across the board and reciprocal tariffs, and he's basically starting a trade war. But maybe there's some hope that somehow this gives. I don't, how do you think this would be used as leverage potentially?
I think that, yeah, again, like with the reciprocal tariffs, like I know that he's doing this because he wants these other countries to back down. However, I don't think they will. Did you see that? Like Canada had said something about how like so basically Canada provides electricity to 30% of states. And I think that their one of their responses was like, oh, if you raise it even more, charge us even more, then we're gonna upcharge your states even more, or we could just completely cut your power off. And I'm like, cool, like that does not seem ideal at all. I saw that China may want a possible trade war. And I saw like Mexico demanding respect from US and saying like, oh, 25% is a lot. But I know that Trump also is doing that for fentanyl issues, which is a whole other topic that we'll get to
Oh
too. I
yeah,
kind of think it's bullshit, but
I agree. It's hard to see what the end game is here, and I guess that's why I was asking about leverage, because I think a lot of what he does is for leverage, but in this case, I don't really see what the leverage or the advantage that we're gaining is. It's just kind of hurting consumers and making a big show of it as if it's going to accomplish something, but like, what is it to achieve? I don't understand. I don't think that economists understand. I don't really even know if Trump understands. I just think it's a whole lot of like chaos, like everything else he does. It's like chaos to unsettle things so that he can come in and like implement whatever he wants in the aftermath of the fallout, pretty much.
I tried my very best to understand how this is going to be strategic and good for the US in the long run. Um, because yeah, like I was trying really hard to, and I think that's why I like pulled out all those numbers and stuff just now because I was like doing all this research and then all this other stuff came out and all I could find was the bad part about it. Did you see how Trump had been speaking directly to the farmers, like the agricultural side, and was kind of saying, "Oh, by the way, this is going to be an adjustment period for you farmers. Like it's going to be expensive for now,"
Yeah.
implying that it'll be expensive for now and then go down for them. And because obviously farmers were such a big voter group for him, don't know why. What does Donald Trump have in common with a farmer in the middle of nowhere America? I have no idea. Um, but this
Well,
is like one of the few times that I thought to myself, like, oh, he is like saying, like, oh, this is an adjustment, like, just wait. I don't know. Anyway, what were you gonna say?
yeah, I was gonna say I had seen that the average like cost or the loss of purchasing power that this would have, according to the Washington Post, was like $1,400 per family. So, I mean, that's a lot. It's pretty significant, especially people paycheck to paycheck. And as you said, those are really his core base of supporters. So, not only do I not understand the end game here, but I also think it's hurting his supporters the most. And so it's really hard to make heads or tails of it. And I think that, like I said, with everything else that he does, he just kind of assumes that like people will agree because like, oh, tariffs are really hard to understand, but he must have a strategy here. But I'm telling you, like you and I both, I think, have really looked into this and tariffs and trade policy, and like I don't think that anyone understands what his strategy is here.
Like, I need to talk face to face with somebody who has extreme knowledge about like the economy, tariffs, foreign trade. I need to just sit down with somebody and have them explain it to me in the most layman terms. Like, I'm trying really hard to understand, and I'm like, is this just an illusion? Is there no good part about this?
I mean, like you said, at best, it might bring some manufacturing back to America, and that would be like that would add jobs and that would
Yeah.
add like productivity to within our borders. But the cost of all of the steps that would have to happen before that would be so great that it could cause just a complete like recession. And I've heard that word thrown around so much this past week, like, oh, we're gonna have a recession. And even Trump himself hasn't like ruled out that that might happen. Okay, so we were just talking about tariffs, and I think we're ready to move on to our next topic. Gavin Newsom started his own podcast recently called This is Gavin Newsom, and he made some controversial statements on there. Particularly, he was talking on transgenders in athletics and whether or not they can participate in the female category. And so I know, Abby, you said you had done some research into this since we last talked about it, because with this new executive order and the new administration, you know, Trump has been very clear, like he says there's two genders and only men can participate with men and women with women. So maybe you can get into some of the research that you had done and then we can bring it back to Gavin Newsom.
Okay. Yeah. So I have wanted to kind of set time aside to do like the actual research and know these numbers about why genetically male and female are different in performing in sports, because I have been saying this opinion, and Colin and I talked about it, I think last week a little bit maybe, and then the week before too. And I guess it was just making me feel a little bit hypocritical that I didn't know the whole, like all the numbers, all the data, all this stuff when like I'm criticizing people when they make arguments if they don't know the full story. So that's kind of the background of like why I decided to listen to podcasts and do some more research. Anyways, I listened to a podcast called The Real Science of Sport podcast with science a sports scientist professor and a sports editor. And they're honestly very progressive people, and they agree that biological males should not be able to compete within the women's sports category. I listened to a really good episode about it, and they explained those biological differences. So basically, like lowering testosterone isn't enough to change the performance factors within biological males. So there's this thing called like hemoglobin concentration, which is like within your red blood. And this is the physical endurance difference between male and females. And when you are lowering your testosterone, that disappears very quickly, and um, it does not take away that male advantage. And even looking at different factors such as muscle mass, body strength, lean mass, body fat percentage, power, there is no evidence that lowering testosterone takes away. It's only a small dent in the original advantage between male and female. So if there's a 30 to 40% difference between male and female in their strength, and a 10 to 15% difference in running speed, the dent that it would make in lowering testosterone is only a fifth at most when lowering it. And this is a study that came out of Sweden. And yeah, they also talked about the argument that, like, if this is the case, then why aren't we just doing co-ed sports divided by weight, height, biological genetics? Because like somebody like Michael Phelps, he has like this insane wingspan that like is definitely biologically he's like biologically gifted. He already like has these advantages that give him the width to perform so much better in his sport. And so for that, if you still get like him plus like Katie Ledecky, say, they still have those differences that make them biologically different because they're male and female. Like they brought up boxing too, in which boxing has a weight category because all the factors that you need with boxing, the only thing that makes it unequal is the weight category. And if you make like biological males and biological females like compete in boxing against each other, but they weigh the same, the male is going to win because of their strength factor. Like, and that's kind of just like all of the encapsulating argument, I think, for why biological males should not be able to perform in women's sports. And it's not an anti-trans issue, I don't think. It's more of a safety category within women's sports. And another thing before we move on, sorry, I've been talking for so long.
No, no,
I
good.
I had asked 8 of my friends, female friend, women who all identify as women, and I said, honest opinion, guys, like I will not judge you. Like, what do you think about trans women competing in female sports? 2 of these friends too were collegiate athletes. All of them are like very left leaning, very liberal, all this stuff, and all of them had the same opinion as me without even doing any of this research. And one of my friends had said something like, I hate that people make this an anti trans thing when I love trans people. Like, I think that they're beautiful humans. I think that everyone should be allowed to do with it what they want with their bodies. But it feels like a slap in the face to women and collegiate athletes who work so hard when they can't do anything about that biological difference. Like, you literally cannot do anything about that. And she is a collegiate athlete too. So maybe that's where that passion comes from. But there's my wrap up of why I think that this is a valid argument.
Yeah, totally. That's really great information to have. It makes a lot of sense. And I was going to say that we glossed over the people who Trump invited to his speech before Congress, but I think one of them was a girl who got injured in a volleyball game playing against a biological male, and obviously not a huge fan of bringing her in, as we said, in a very performative way and sort of being like, and here's the proof right here. But what you're saying is that there is biological data and studies that have been done that show that there is an unfair advantage, someone born male competing against someone born female, and that should be taken into consideration. And like Title IX was implemented to protect women in sports. And so the reversal of Title IX that kind of was happening with the NCAA and under Biden, and in California, where this was seen as like kind of the trend. It was sort of, I feel like California is often on the forefront of a lot of progressive policies, and I think that this was one issue where they were kind of like trying things out, like seeing where they could take it in terms of allowing people born male to participate in female sports. And I think it was a failure of a trial, and I think we learned a lot from it. And I think there was a lot of good productive research that came out of it. And now it's kind of a consensus across the board for like 80% of Americans. But so Gavin Newsom, I don't know that he ever like I can't really speak to what his personal views ever were or even are now because I think he does a lot of flip-flopping. But how
Mhm.
does that make you feel in particular where, he kind of allowed a lot of stuff to happen in California under the guise that this was like liberal and this was progressive, but then now that like Trump is in office and now that Newsom might be eyeing a presidential run and this is an unpopular policy with Americans, he's suddenly back on the side of the right almost.
Like you said, I'm really confused on where he originally stands. I can flip-flop it both ways and like, oh, were you just agreeing with all of these liberal policies because you're the governor of California, or are you moderating your making yourself more moderate because he wants that 2028 nomination and presidency? Like, I don't know, but I'm not a fan of
I think that
Newsom either.
one.
I'm not a fan of Newsom either. I honestly think a lot of people aren't a fan of him. At least like to college in California, San Diego, I remember talking to a lot of different people about Newsom. And personally, for me, I never changed voting out of Nevada. I liked voting out of Nevada and I liked voting in my local politics. So I never was able to vote out of San Diego County. So I never voted for Newsom or anything like that. But what about you? What are your
Well, I
thoughts on him?
remember like our sophomore year when we were still kind of in the midst of COVID, I was not a fan of California's policies around COVID with the mandates and the passports and all of this. Just as someone who's more like libertarian minded, that bothered me. And also the way that California politicians were still going out in public and like still, I think Newsom and Pelosi were both in public, like on people like recorded them in public at restaurants and getting Pelosi getting her hair done and all this. It just felt like the height of hypocrisy. That
Yeah.
made me angry about Newsom. Like that's like strike one. Strike two was probably, let me see, probably when the president of China visited San Francisco and Newsom like quickly had the entire city cleaned up. And I had just been in San Francisco earlier that year, and it was extremely terrible. Tons of homeless people, tons of garbage everywhere. Like it's a nice city. Like the foundation of San Francisco is a nice place, a nice city, but there's tons of violence and tons of drugs and tons of criminality. And it's like Newsom, the second that the Chinese president showed up, cleaned the whole place up and was like making gestures. He was very overt about it too. Like he said, like, "Oh yeah, it's nice when you have guests over to like clean up or something like this." I'm like, dude, so you'll do
You're
it for
like, you
the
should have
Chinese
done
president?
this way sooner.
Yeah. So that was like probably strike two. I don't know if this is strike three. Strike three might be the wildfires.
Yeah, I did
Um,
not like how he handled the wildfires at all. I think a lot of people didn't like it.
so he's on strike four now because
So he's out of here.
starting a podcast in hopes of maybe having a presidential nomination in 2028. That's what it seems like to me. Um, First of all, if he's the governor of California, how does he have time to host a podcast? I just think that's ridiculous. Like, you and I know how much it takes to have a podcast every
I'm
week.
like, we're working 9 to 5s and we're like struggling to.
If I was the governor of California, I would not have time for a podcast and I would not make the time for a podcast because there's so many other things wrong with that state. It's a nice state. It's a really great place to live, but it's not a priority to be having a podcast right now. And my only hope, I hope that Kamala and Newsom will duke it out and they'll pick which one of them should be the nominee in 2028 because I think he obviously wants it. She might have actually she's kind of signaled maybe like she'll go for the governorship of California. That would be very interesting. But not a Newsom fan, never have been. This doesn't help. Shouldn't be starting a podcast. He has way more bigger issues, bigger fish to fry, and that's all I got.
Do you remember when Newsom was visiting San Diego and somebody had pitched a story about like interviewing him or
Oh
something like
yeah,
that?
yeah.
And then our advisor was like, "No." Like she said no so effing fast. She was like, "No, we're not giving PR to anyone. I hate those people." She was like saying, "I hate those people. I hate giving PR to these government people," stuff like that. But
Well,
it made me
yeah.
think that she really is also a Newsom hater.
Well, they just try to spin like any opportunity they get to be in front of the press, they will just try to spin. So that's why I'm like the listening value of this podcast of his has got to be absolute garbage because it's just a political tool in his toolkit. I can't imagine that they're actually having like he's going to have substantive guests and conversations. That I just, you know, pigs will fly maybe before before I believe that that'll happen.
Well,
Um,
I have a very similar opinion as to you. Like, I don't think that politicians should be involved in any stake in the media. I think that we're here to check them. And it's the same reason why, yeah, like I just don't think that they don't belong there. I don't know how he has time for it. Like, I know he's not doing the nitty-gritty editing or anything like that, but even setting an hour or two aside to record seems like a lot.
Yeah, I mean, vanity, I think, is a theme with him, unfortunately. And he's really, despite all of his vanity, despite all of his maneuvering, he's really not that popular among Californians. Like you just said, our sophomore year when we were in college, he was being recalled, and it was like not a done deal, like that he would survive that. There was a lot of talk that Larry Elder would replace him and have a Republican governor. So, yeah, he's unpopular. I don't think it bodes well for his odds in 2028. And yeah, that's what I got.
All I got too. What is our next topic, Colin?
Well, there were some developments with the Idaho murders with the University of Idaho. Obviously that happened in 2022, and it was a horrible, brutal murder of, I think, four students.
Hmm.
And so Brian Kohlberger was eventually arrested for allegedly committing those murders. But there's some developments as, his trial is approaching, some new evidence coming out. And so did you follow that this week?
Yes, the transcripts of texts between Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, I want to say is how you pronounce her last name, had been released to the public. And basically, it was just them texting each other about how freaked out they were. One of them said, like, yeah, I'm freaking out, and how no one was answering when they were talking to each other as well. Um, One of them had referenced somebody wearing all black, and then somebody else had said that they saw what looked like a man with a ski mask in the house, and um, they were just going back and forth about being how freaked out they were, and then Funk had tried to convince Mortensen to go to her room so that they could be together. And then also the 911 transcript as well. And the reason that I think it's relevant that these details come out is that I really, really strongly dislike the fact that people are villainizing these girls. For me, I also lived with like a ton of roommates. Like I lived with my senior year, I lived with five other people. And like in college, you're not thinking to yourself that you're ever going to be a victim of anything. Like I can't imagine. Like it literally makes me emotional thinking about it. Like I can't even imagine being in that scenario and to like have that sort of trauma and survivor's guilt most likely and have people online saying that you're a bad friend or that you're a horrible person because they didn't help their roommates even though they saw what was happening or they saw um a
Yeah.
man in a ski mask. Like it's just a lot for me every time this case comes up.
Yeah. I mean, this case has a lot of power among our age group because within a couple of years, we were pretty much the same age as these students who were killed. And our mutual friend who was editor-in-chief before me, she wrote a piece when it happened,
Hmm.
interviewing our fellow students about, just our thoughts of this was before they had arrested anyone in the case, and just like
Hmm.
a reaction piece essentially from the student body. And I mean, all the sentiments you just explained was pretty much what the piece uncovered. It was just college age students, like you said, that's not what you think is ever going to happen. And so the reaction that these two had to the murders that happened, it makes sense to me that it was sort of like a shock response, like uh, fight or flight is often what people say, and when you just experience this horrible trauma, I don't think people should necessarily be judged for like the particulars of how they respond. you kind of just have like a survival instinct kick in. And I think one of the texts said that like she literally just ran from one room to the other to like so
Mhm.
that they could be safe in the same room as opposed to, like each being separated because who like they didn't know maybe the dude was going to come back or maybe like he was still in the house. Maybe you know, they just had no idea what was happening. So I don't in any way think they should be judged for how they handled it as it was unfolding right after the fact, or even I think it was like several hours before the police were called, and people had thought that was suspicious. I don't think that that's an indication of anything in and of itself. And I think there's, pretty I don't know if you can say the word that they're exonerated, but it definitely seems like they're certainly not the suspects at the moment, and I don't think they should be judged as if they are, or
And I
as if they bear some culpability somehow.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that they were drunk during this time too. Like all of them had gotten home from a night out. And oh my God, like if I put myself in those shoes, I can't even imagine like what that must feel like. And I saw this comment that said something like it was defending the girls and saying something like you had said that survival instincts are flight, fight, or freeze a lot of the time, and they had frozen, which is such a freaking like valid response to this. Like you don't know what it's like to be in something like this until you are. And to the people who are tearing them apart still, I think that they're re-traumatizing them, and I really, really hope that they aren't seeing the brute force or the brute of these comments. Like I hope that somebody's like monitoring their phones or something like that to like make sure that they don't see everything that's going on online.
Where was the majority of the negative comments coming from? Was it like TikTok? Was it just on like comments on news articles? Like, where's what platform?
I For me, I don't really use Instagram for anything other than like keeping up with friends. So for me, I saw a lot of young people defending them versus like older people not. Like I saw stitches of like older people being like, why are we like giving these girls grace? Like they could have saved their friends and they didn't. And like stitches from maybe people our age being like, you don't know what it's like to be living. Like, you know what I'm saying? Which I honestly think is a really good thing to see. I think that our generation has a good amount of empathy for things like this and for other people our age.
That's really strange because I have a hard time, like my mind can't even understand really the perspective that would attack the surviving roommates. I think that that's so like sick that imagining anyone like getting on their phone and being like, this is what I'm gonna do with my time is like attack surviving roommates of this heinous murder. Like it just doesn't something is broken there. I don't know what it is, but well, actually, I have a kind of a speculation. I think maybe like you said, if it was older people and they might have some kind of like resentment of their own regarding like youth and young people, and college is a more kind of like supposed to be carefree time of your life. Maybe people who either never had that experience or like are jealous of it, see it and they have hatred toward it for that reason. I don't know, but it's bizarre to like even try to get into that headspace that would, attack survivors really.
I saw one comment saying something like, if I was their roommate, like I wouldn't be texting about it, like I would be going to the police or doing this or doing that. And I don't know, I found that another reason why I'm like, you just don't know what it's like unless you're in it. Like it just breaks my heart. It does.
Yeah, and so I mean that's all I got for that, but we should, if as a trial is happening, I'm sure we'll talk about that because it was such a big story. There's a lot of cultural impact and maybe even like legal impact as well from this case because some of the evidence that they're trying to admit into the trial is kind of facing scrutiny as well. So hopefully we can come back to this story as it unfolds.
Okay. Next topic, I believe we're going to be talking about.
Influencers and media.
Oh, yes. Okay. Influencers replacing journalists. So, for everyone who isn't aware, at least on my algorithm, I've seen this conversation kind of blow up on my algorithm on TikTok, basically, because there was this video trending, a little clip of these two influencer girls interviewing Megan the Stallion, and she had like made some comment that said something like, "Oh, like all your songs or like your music, like it just always makes me want to fight," or something like that. And Megan the Stallion kind of had a little bit of an adverse reaction, and the rest of the media kind of did too, because they were like, "Oh, her music isn't really about fighting; it's like body yada yada," you know what I'm saying, like stuff like that. And it sparked this really interesting conversation that everyone was talking about in regard to influencers taking over on the red carpet and interviewing and doing things that normal journalists would be doing. And I actually saw this hashtag that was like bring back real journalists. And I don't know, I just thought it would be interesting for Colin and I to talk about because I definitely think we have some credibility in talking about this because even though we have made jokes before and we're like, are we real journalists? I think we are. And I think that we've trained in interviewing, especially like important people. What do you think about influencers in journalism?
I'm definitely gonna put that hashtag on this video. And also, no, I think it's valid, like what makes you a quote unquote real journalist versus not. And that's something I've kind of been contending with personally because we've been in like the news game for, I don't know, going on 4 years now, but sometimes you still feel like imposter syndrome creep in. And honestly, like that what we're doing right now, this format, this is the most that I've ever felt like a real journalist, just because it's like completely independent, completely self-motivated, and we're the ones driving everything. And I had this moment actually when we were talking about the Ukraine war reaching 3 years and how we'd been covering it from the beginning, and then I saw this protest happening and gave updates on this show about what was happening on the ground in DC in regards to that. That was the moment for me. I was like, oh, like this is legit. Like we've been in this game for years at this point. I think it's safe to say that like we're quote unquote real journalists, which is absurd that it took that long for it to like sink in to realize like, oh, I would be doing this regardless. Like this is just what I do. Like I think being a journalist is something that will always be a part of me no matter what I'm doing. So those are just some thoughts that like everything you just said brought up for me.
Me too. I have a really hard time with imposter syndrome a lot of the time. But Colin had said something funny to me over the weekend. He said that he thinks that both of us do some of our best work when we're like juggling a million things, which I think is so true. And I think that encapsulates a lot of like what journalism is as well, because you're balancing so much in under a short amount of time. Like the news cycle is moving so fast. And if you're not juggling a bunch of things, then you're probably doing it wrong, honestly. Like you need to be talking to A, B, and C and like confirming your sources and doing all these things. And when you're interviewing, you need to be talking to people a certain way. You need to be getting the right interviews. And just to bring it back to the influencers and journalist topic, like I agree, like bring back real journalists. And that doesn't even come from a space of biases. Like I love my influencer girly pops here and there. Like I'm a really big Emma Chamberlain fan, for example. Um, and I love being like influenced, I guess, quote unquote. And just like those little fun little like vlogs or whatever that are like a minute long. But I don't like the favoritism that comes out of like getting influencers at an event to interview people because people are more likely to watch the video or something when the questions aren't as substantive or the interview just isn't even an interview, it's more just a conversation, which interviews are supposed to be conversations, but like
They should be
not
like
like
they should be probing for something, like something new.
that.
Like the journalist is always after the scoop or like even it can get very aggressive and they'll just go for like a soundbite. They're looking for like something that hasn't been said before versus like what you're saying with interviewers, or sorry, with influencers, they can just be very like superficial, topical, they're not like digging for more, which is a skill, I think.
Yeah, I think that interviewing is a skill. It could be definitely taught, but it 100% is a skill that needs to be learned. Like, I don't think that people realize how much work goes into interviewing and how much you actually need to focus on the pre work, the during. Like, it could change really fast. You need really good people skills as well. So I don't know. I'm not a fan of influencers taking the job of journalists, even if it is just like a soft news, like red carpet event or anything like that. It actually reminded me of an assignment that we had to do for our advisors, one of our advisors' classes, at least. For me, I had to interview other journalists, and all three of the other journalists that I interviewed had said, "Oh, interviewing journalists is the worst. Like, journalists hate being interviewed and they give the worst effing answers because they know what it's like to do stuff like that. Like, they're really good at concealing the truth, I guess, because like journalists are horrible to interview. They either ramble a lot or they don't say enough."
Yeah, that's pretty funny. That was a funny assignment too, but it gave some perspective. And I also had to do that assignment, interview some journalists, and what they told me was like being a journalist in today's day and age in the information era is less about like it's less about breaking stories as much as it is like who can synthesize it the best. Because you kind of have this presumption these days that, like, the information is out there somewhere. It's just a matter of collecting it, organizing it in the right way so that's maximally like presentable to a general audience. And I do think influencers can do that skill as well, but it takes a lot of practice, and I don't think we should take that for granted from the journalists who kind of started at the bottom, worked their way up, and have been doing this for years and years. Because they're probably more skilled at that than influencers who I think the influencers are they cater toward the algorithm. They know like what's trendy and what's going to be popular, but they might miss the underlying truth sometimes.
I agree with that.
We could do our bonus topics now, I feel like.
Yeah, totally. I think we could.
So probably for number one, I'll just give a very quick brief update about the Department of Education because we left off last week's show kind of with like a wink and a nod of like, oh, look out, it might be on the cutting block. And Monday came around and Linda McMahon was confirmed as the head of the department by by Congress. But she didn't like immediately end the DOE. She did send out an email to like DOE staff, I think, just indicating that she was going to be working toward the goal of ending the department, that was President Trump's wish, and that she saw herself as sort of like the conduit through which they could end the department. There was some interesting wording. She said like we're on a final mission or something like this. But as of now, it hasn't been ended, and we're gonna have to wait and see where that goes.
What do you think is going to happen there? What's your prediction if you had to have one?
Um, I think they'll go back to how it used to be before the DOE was its own department. It used to be under like I don't know. It was a sub department of another cabinet position. I forget which one, but I think they'll go back to something like that where they'll either like privatize student loans or nestle it under a different section of government. And I do think that they'll try to end the DOE though.
Yeah, me too. I don't have anything to
Yeah,
add,
that's it for now.
but do we want to talk about Dolly Parton now?
Yeah, we'll leave it off on Dolly Parton's husband passing.
Yes, Dolly Parton's husband, who she'd been with since she was 18, and I believe he was 23. Carl, remind me his last name?
I think his name's Carl Dean.
Carl Dean. Long time that they've been together. He died at 83, I believe. And she had written a song in honor of him. It's called If You Hadn't Been There. And let me tell you, viewers, and Colin knows this, I listened to this song and cried at my 9 to 5 job because what a testament to such a strong relationship, traditional relationship that I feel like isn't really shown in the media as much. What did you think about that?
No, I totally agree. So I listened to it the day it dropped as well, and at first she starts off like kind of shaky. Her voice isn't like quite as powerful as some of her other stuff from when she was like much younger. But as it like builds and builds and builds, she's like belting out by the middle of it, and it's so heart-wrenching to know that like this is her reaction to losing her husband of like 60 years. I There's a line in there that I really love that did kind of make me a little teary where she says, "You made me dream more than I dared." And I don't know, something about that just gets me because like she moved to Nashville, I think at like very, very young, and they ran into each other, I believe, at like a laundromat, and just like that doesn't happen these days. You don't really get like organic meetings of like-minded people who just really, function well together and are temperamentally aligned and have the same values and both want to be monogamous and have like the next 60 years of their life that they want to spend together. Like that just seems like a fairy tale by today's standards. Maybe that's always been a fairy tale and they just had that fairy tale. And if so, I think it's really beautiful, something maybe that Gen Z can aspire to a little bit.
Yeah, I totally think that whatever you want in life, you can get in regard, or like you could reach for or get in regard to relationships. Like I know like not everyone's for monogamy. Me personally, I am. Um, I've been surrounded by a lot of healthy monogamous like relationships that still to this day I can tell the people around me are so deeply in love. Like my parents, like I think I'm very lucky to know what good love looks like, and I'm really happy that I was raised in that environment, and also my grandparents and their parents as well. Like I just like feel like I've always been surrounded by like quote unquote like fairy tale love where like you're yourself, you're communicative, all this stuff. And what sucks to me is like it really is seems harder to meet people nowadays. I hate the dating apps.
Oh, dating apps have destroyed dating. It's brutal out there. Would not recommend.
Like horrible. And every single person I talk to about the dating apps are like, yeah, like it actually sucks. But it's
Everyone,
like but no one really wants to meet organically these or not that they don't want to, but it's like you don't really go to the grocery store and like approach anyone now or like have small talk with strangers or anything like that. If anyone did that to me while I was grocery shopping now, I'd be like, bro, I just got off my 9 to 5, like get away from me. So maybe I'm a part of the problem too. But do you know what I'm saying?
oh, I totally know what you're saying. Yeah, like we need better role models, and I think that their relationship was one that people could strive to emulate. And clearly they had a very impactful relationship. They didn't have any kids of their own, which I think is also interesting because they were traditional in many ways, but not in every way. So I just think that's something to point out as well.
Yeah, the song hit really hard, like, and I think was a very beautiful way to honor her late husband. I think that there was probably some personal plugins and ties in there that I'm sure that only they two understand. So it was just a lovely way to honor him. And that's all from me.
Yeah, the only other thing I have for this week, also in the music realm, Lady Gaga dropped a new album on Friday also, and I thought it was really great, so I totally wanted to plug that for anyone listening. Um, I think it could be album of the year, but
Wow. Okay, I'll have to listen.
that's all I
Okay,
got for now.
me too. Okay, washed up out.